Carmen's laugh echoed across the service station as she balanced 4 plates on her arm with the effortless grace of someone who'd been doing this for years. Table 6 wants extra Parmesan, and the gentleman at 12 is asking for you specifically again. I glanced up from wiping down wine glasses, my stomach doing that familiar flutter it always did when Antonio Bandini requested my section. 3 months he'd been coming here, and I still couldn't figure out why a man who clearly had better places to be chose to spend his Friday nights at the Golden Fork. He tips well, Carmen continued, nudging me with her elbow, and he's easy on the eyes. What's the problem? The problem was that everything about Antonio Bandini set off alarm bells in my head. Not the kind that screamed danger. Well, not entirely. But the kind that whispered secrets. My degree in criminal psychology had trained me to read people, to spot the tells that most missed. And Antonio had tells written all over him in a language I was still trying to decode. No problem, I lied, smoothing down my black apron and checking my reflection in the stainless steel surface of the coffee machine. My blonde hair was still neatly twisted into its usual work bun, though a few strands had escaped during the dinner rush. At 26, I'd learned to present a competent, approachable image, essential in the service industry, where your paycheck depended on people liking you enough to leave decent tips. The dining room hummed with the usual Friday night energy. Couples celebrating anniversaries, business associates closing deals over expensive wine, groups of friends unwinding after long weeks. I'd become an expert at reading the social dynamics, understanding the subtle hierarchies and unspoken tensions that played out across white tablecloths and flickering candles. Tonight, though, something felt different. I'd first noticed it around 10:30 when a man in an expensive charcoal suit had taken table 8. Nothing unusual there. The Golden Fork attracted Chicago's well-dressed crowd. But this particular customer had ordered 3 drinks in the past hour without touching any of them. Instead, he sat with his back straight, shoulders tense, checking his watch with the obsessive regularity of someone operating on a precise timeline. More concerning was his positioning. Table 8 offered a perfect sightline to Table 12, Antonio's usual spot. Every few minutes, the man's gaze would drift in that direction, not obviously, but with the kind of peripheral awareness that spoke of professional surveillance. Then there was the guy at the bar. Mid-30s, expensive Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, nursing the same whiskey for 45 minutes. He'd positioned himself with clear views of both the main entrance and the kitchen corridor, his posture too rigid for someone supposedly relaxing after work. The way he kept adjusting his jacket suggested he was carrying something he didn't want noticed. A third man had claimed the small table near the restrooms 20 minutes ago. Prime real estate for monitoring the back exit. The route staff used, and I'd noticed, the path Antonio always took when leaving. This one was younger, maybe early 30s, with the kind of nervous energy that manifested in constant motion. Checking his phone, straightening his silverware, drumming silent rhythms against his thigh. My psychology training had taught me to recognize patterns of behavior, and these 3 men were exhibiting classic pre-action anxiety. Elevated breathing, repetitive gestures, hypervigilance, all signs of people preparing for something significant. Maybe I was being paranoid. God knows studying criminal behavior had made me see threats in perfectly innocent situations before. But the coordination of their positioning, the synchronized timing of their movements, the way they all maintained awareness of Table 12 while pretending to focus on their own evening. Earth to Elena, Carmen's voice cut through my thoughts. Your mysterious Italian is waiting for his usual wine service. I grabbed the bottle of Barolo Antonio always ordered, a vintage that cost more than I made in 2 days, and approached Table 12. He looked up as I neared, those storm-gray eyes of his conducting their usual assessment. Everything about Antonio Bandini was controlled, calculated, from the precise knot of his tie to the way he folded his napkin. 6'2" of carefully contained power wrapped in bespoke Italian wool. Good evening, Mr. Bandini, I said, proud that my voice betrayed none of the unease building in my chest. The usual tonight? Please. That accent again. Definitely European, though I'd never been able to place it exactly. Roman? Sicilian? It carried an undertone of authority that made even simple requests sound like commands. As I poured his wine, I found myself cataloging details about him that I'd been unconsciously collecting for months. The way he always sat with his back to the wall, how his eyes continuously swept the room in careful patterns, the expensive watch on his wrist that he checked with military precision, the subtle bulge beneath his left shoulder that suggested either a very thick wallet or something more concerning. "You seem distracted tonight," he observed, his voice quiet enough that only I could hear. "Something troubling you." Before I could answer, movement caught my peripheral vision. The man at table 8 had pulled out his phone again, this time speaking in hushed tones. I strained to catch fragments of his conversation as I pretended to examine the wine label. 23:45, he was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back exit. Everything's in position." My blood turned to ice. 23:45 was exactly 15 minutes away. The back exit was the route Antonio always used. And "everything's in position" suggested coordination between multiple parties. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. 3 men positioned strategically around the restaurant, all maintaining visual contact with table 12, all operating on the same timeline, all focused on Antonio Bandini's usual departure routine. I glanced at my watch. 23:30. 15 minutes until... What? An ambush? An assassination attempt? Whatever these men were planning, it was scheduled to happen exactly when Antonio would be walking toward his car through the back exit. My hands trembled as I finished pouring his wine. Every instinct screamed at me to mind my own business, to finish my shift and go home to my studio apartment, where the most dangerous thing I faced was the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter. But I couldn't shake the image of Antonio walking unsuspecting into whatever trap was being set. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe my overactive psychology training was reading malice into innocent coincidence. But what if I wasn't? What if those 15 minutes were all that stood between Antonio Bandini and disaster? "Mr. Bandini," I said quietly, leaning forward as if to adjust his place setting. "I might be completely wrong, but I think you should stay quiet and not move. Something's planned for 23:45. His hand stilled on his wine glass, those gray eyes sharpening with sudden focus. For a heartbeat, we existed in a bubble of shared tension, while the restaurant continued its oblivious hum around us. "Explain," he said, his voice so low I almost missed it. 3 men, table 8, the bar, and near the restrooms. They've been watching you for the past hour. Coordinated positioning, synchronized timing, pre-action anxiety behaviors. The words tumbled out in a rush of professional terminology mixed with genuine fear. I heard fragments about 23:45 and the back exit. Antonio's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A coiling of muscles, a readiness that transformed him from elegant dinner companion to something far more dangerous. "You're certain?" I wasn't certain of anything except the rapid beating of my heart and the cold sweat breaking out across my palms. "No. But yes, maybe. I study this stuff, behavioral analysis, and everything about them screams surveillance." He reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, and withdrew his phone. A few quick taps, then he set it face down beside his plate. "Done." What's done? That ghost of a smile I'd seen before, sharp and predatory. Insurance. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation, though at the time I could barely process the chaos erupting around me. Antonio's phone buzzed once, a response to whatever message he'd sent. Within seconds, 3 men in dark suits materialized from various corners of the restaurant like shadows coming to life. I hadn't even noticed them before, which should have terrified me more than it did. The man at table 8 never saw it coming. One moment he was checking his watch for the 100th time. The next he was face down on his dinner plate with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made my stomach lurch. His phone clattered across the marble floor, screen cracked. The guy at the bar tried to run. Bad choice. He made it exactly 3 steps before disappearing behind a wall of expensive Italian wool and controlled violence. Other diners looked up from their meals with the mild curiosity of people watching street performers, completely unaware they were witnessing something far more dangerous. The 3rd man, the one near the restrooms, showed more survival instinct. He bolted for the back exit, the same route he'd been monitoring all evening. I lost sight of him in the corridor, but the muffled sounds that echoed back suggested his escape attempt hadn't been successful. Through it all, Antonio remained seated, calmly finishing his wine, as if orchestrating tactical takedowns was as routine as ordering dessert. "We need to leave," he said quietly, standing and placing a crisp $100 bill on the table. "Now. I can't just leave work. My shift isn't— Your shift is over." His hand found the small of my back, steering me toward the main entrance with gentle but absolute authority. "Trust me when I say you don't want to be here when the police arrive to investigate what just happened." My legs felt disconnected from my brain as we walked through the dining room. Carmen caught my eye from across the restaurant, her expression confused as she watched me leave with a customer. I wanted to explain, to tell her I'd call later, but Antonio's pace never slowed. Outside, a black sedan waited with the engine running. Not the kind of coincidence that happened in normal people's lives. "Get in," Antonio said, opening the rear door. Every rational thought in my head screamed warnings. This was how people disappeared. This was how normal lives ended, and bodies ended up in rivers. But what choice did I have? I'd just witnessed what happened to people who crossed Antonio Bandini, and I was pretty sure refusing his invitation would put me in that category. The interior smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Antonio slid in beside me, maintaining careful distance while somehow still dominating the space. The driver, a mountain of a man with graying temples, pulled away from the curb without a word. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, proud that my voice only shook slightly. "Somewhere safe while we sort this out." "Sort what out?" "I don't even know what just happened back there." Antonio studied me with those storm-gray eyes, calculating something behind their depths. "You saved my life tonight. That tends to complicate things." We drove through Chicago's late-night streets in tense silence. I recognized the neighborhoods at first, familiar territory near my apartment building. But as we headed further north, the scenery shifted to areas I knew only from magazines and news reports about the wealthy elite. The safe house turned out to be a penthouse apartment in a gleaming tower that scraped the belly of the night sky. More armed men waited in the lobby, their presence transforming what should have been elegant surroundings into something that felt distinctly like a fortress. "This is temporary," Antonio assured me as we rode the private elevator to the 32nd floor. "Just until we understand the full scope of tonight's events." The apartment was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, furniture that belonged in design magazines, art that probably cost more than most people's houses. But it was also clearly a place designed for security rather than comfort. No personal touches, multiple exit routes visible, and the subtle bulges under the jackets of the two men who'd followed us up suggested this was more prison than refuge. "I need to call my job," I said, fishing for my phone. "Carmen will be worried, and my manager—" "Already handled." A woman appeared from the kitchen area, moving with quiet efficiency. Mid-30s, elegant in an understated way, with intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. "I spoke with your supervisor an hour ago. You've come down with food poisoning and won't be in for the next few days." I stared at her. "Who are you?" "Sofia Romano, Mr. Bandini's assistant." She extended a perfectly manicured hand. "I've prepared the guest room for you, and there are clothes in your size in the closet. If you need anything else, please let me know." "How do you know my size?" That same calculating look I'd seen from Antonio. "We're very thorough in our research, Miss Morrison." The casual mention of research sent fresh chills through me. How much did they know? How long had they been watching me? And why did I suddenly feel like a specimen under a microscope? Antonio had disappeared into another room. An office, judging by the glimpse of computers and communication equipment I caught before the door closed. Sophia gestured for me to follow her down a hallway, lined with abstract paintings that probably cost more than my college education. "You must have questions," she said as we walked. "About 1,000 of them, Mr. Bandini will answer what he can tomorrow. For tonight, try to rest. It's been an eventful evening." The guest room was larger than my entire apartment, decorated in soothing blues and grays that should have been calming but somehow weren't. Sophia had laid out clothes on the bed, designer labels I recognized from window shopping expeditions I could never afford. "How did you know I'd be coming here?" I asked, fingering the soft fabric of a cashmere sweater. Sophia paused in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Bandini is a man who plans for contingencies. He's been aware of you for some time, Miss Morrison. Aware of me, how? But she was already gone, leaving me alone with questions that multiplied faster than I could process them. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every sound from the hallway made me jump. Every distant voice made me wonder if I was about to become another casualty in whatever war I'd stumbled into. By dawn, I'd worn a path in the expensive carpet from pacing. Sophia appeared with coffee and pastries around 8, her efficiency suggesting she'd dealt with traumatized houseguests before. Mr. Bandini would like to speak with you when you're ready, she said, setting the tray on a small table near the windows. And if I'm not ready? A slight smile. Then he'll wait. But Miss Morrison, the longer you wait, the more questions you'll have, and the fewer answers will satisfy you. She was right, of course. I'd spent the night constructing increasingly elaborate theories about who Antonio Bandini was and what I'd gotten myself into. None of them were particularly comforting. I found him in the office, surrounded by monitors displaying what looked like security feeds from various locations around the city. He'd changed from his dinner attire into dark jeans and a white shirt, looking younger and somehow more dangerous in casual clothes. "Sleep well?" he asked without turning from the screens. "Did you expect me to?" That ghost of a smile. "No, but I hoped." He swiveled to face me, those gray eyes conducting their usual assessment. "How much do you know about organized crime in Chicago, Elena?" The use of my first name sent an unexpected flutter through my chest. Only what everyone knows. That it exists, that people get hurt, that normal people try to stay as far away from it as possible. Smart policy. Unfortunately, no longer an option for you. Because I saved your life. Because you witnessed Riccardo Torino attempting to have me killed. And because your intervention allowed my men to capture 2 of his people alive. Antonio stood, moving to pour coffee from a service I hadn't noticed. "Torino will assume you're working with me. That makes you a target." The casual way he delivered this death sentence made my knees weak. For how long? Until Torino is no longer a problem. And how long will that take? Antonio handed me a cup of coffee, his fingers brushing mine briefly. That depends on how smart he is, and how quickly he realizes his war with my family was always going to end only one way. Family. The word carried weight I was only beginning to understand. Saturday morning came with the harsh reality that my life had fundamentally changed overnight. I woke in sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent, in a room that could house 3 families, guarded by men whose job was to ensure I never left without permission. The panic attack hit me before I was fully conscious, my chest constricted, air becoming impossible to draw into my lungs. The elegant bedroom walls seemed to close in, transforming from sanctuary to prison cell. My hands shook as I gripped the expensive bedding, trying to ground myself in something tangible, while my mind spiraled through every worst-case scenario my psychology training had ever made me aware of. I was going to disappear. Become another statistic. Another missing person whose case would gather dust in some detective's filing cabinet. No one would even know where to start looking. "Miss Morrison?" Sophia's voice carried through the door, accompanied by a gentle knock. "I've brought breakfast." I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting to 4 on each inhale, holding for 4, exhaling for 6. The technique Dr. Martinez had taught me during my grief counseling after Mom died, back when panic attacks were about medical bills and funeral arrangements, not about being held captive by organized criminals. "I'm fine," I called out, proud that my voice sounded relatively normal. "May I come in?" Did I have a choice? Everything about my situation was phrased as requests, but the armed guards outside made it clear that refusal wasn't really an option. Sophia entered carrying a silver tray laden with coffee, fresh fruit, and what looked like homemade pastries. She moved with the same quiet efficiency I'd noticed before, setting everything on the small table near the windows overlooking the city. "Mr. Bandini had to leave early this morning," she said, pouring coffee into delicate china cups. "Business matters requiring his attention. Business matters. A euphemism that could mean anything from board meetings to executions. When can I go home?" Sophia's hands stilled for just a moment, the first crack in her professional composure I'd witnessed. That depends on several factors currently outside our control. You mean it depends on whether Riccardo Torino decides to kill me or not? Mr. Bandini won't let that happen. The certainty in her voice should have been comforting. Instead, it reminded me that my survival now depended entirely on the whims of a man I barely knew. A man whose world operated by rules I couldn't begin to understand. I spent the morning pacing the penthouse like a caged animal. The apartment was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Chicago. Furniture that belonged in design magazines. Artwork that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime. But beauty couldn't disguise the fact that I was essentially a prisoner. Every door led to rooms I wasn't supposed to enter. Every window was 40 stories above the ground. Every exit was monitored by men who smiled politely while making it clear that leaving wasn't an option. By afternoon, I'd worked myself into such a state of anxious energy that I decided to test the boundaries of my captivity. I need some air, I told Sophia. Maybe a walk around the building? Her expression remained perfectly neutral. I'm afraid that's not possible at the moment. Then maybe the lobby? Just to feel like I'm not completely trapped? Miss Morrison, I understand this is difficult, but... No, you don't understand. The words exploded out of me with more force than I'd intended. You don't understand what it's like to have your entire life turned upside down because you tried to do the right thing. You don't understand what it's like to be told you're a target for murder because you warned someone about an assassination attempt. And you definitely don't understand what it's like to be imprisoned in a golden cage by the same person you saved. Sophia absorbed my outburst without flinching, her composure intact. You're right. I don't understand those specific circumstances. But I do understand being caught between impossible choices and dangerous people. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. Really look. Past the professional demeanor and expensive clothes. Her eyes held shadows that spoke of experiences she'd never share. Of decisions that had cost her more than she'd ever admit. How long have you worked for him? 7 years. And in those 7 years, how many people like me have you had to accommodate? A slight smile touched her lips. You're the first. That should have made me feel special. Instead, it made me feel like an experiment. Sunday brought a second panic attack and my first escape attempt. I waited until I heard Sophia leave for what she called her weekly errands, then made my move. The guards at the front entrance were positioned to watch for people coming in, not necessarily for residents going out. If I moved with confidence, dressed appropriately, maybe I could simply walk past them like I belonged there. I made it exactly 3 floors down in the elevator before it stopped between floors. The lights dimmed, then came back up, and when the doors opened again, one of Antonio's men was waiting for me. Miss Morrison, he said politely, as if encountering me in an elevator between floors was perfectly normal. Mr. Bandini asked me to escort you back to the apartment. The shame of being caught trying to escape burned hotter than the fear. I'd acted like a frightened child instead of the educated woman I was supposed to be. But what choice did I have? Sit quietly and wait for someone to decide my fate. Antonio returned that evening, his presence filling the apartment with an energy that made my skin prickle with awareness. He'd changed from his morning suit into dark jeans and a black sweater, looking younger and somehow more dangerous in casual clothes. I hear you had an eventful day, he said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. Heat flooded my cheeks. I needed some air. And you thought wandering Chicago alone while Riccardo Torino has a price on your head was a good way to get it. I thought maybe I could go back to my normal life and pretend none of this happened. He turned to face me, those storm-gray eyes conducting their usual assessment. Your normal life ended Friday night when you chose to warn me instead of minding your own business. So I'm being punished for doing the right thing? You're being protected because doing the right thing put you in the crosshairs of very dangerous people. The rational part of my brain understood the logic, but the emotional part, the part that felt like a prisoner despite the luxury surroundings, wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. Tell me about your mother, Antonio said suddenly, the apparent non sequitur catching me off guard. What about her? Sophia mentioned she passed away recently. The medical bills that forced you to take the waitressing job. I wrapped my arms around myself, the familiar grief settling over me like a heavy blanket. Lung cancer, 3 years of treatments, surgeries, experimental therapies. None of it worked. but it bankrupted our family trying. That's why you studied criminal psychology. You wanted to understand the people who prey on vulnerable families. The insight caught me off guard. I'd never articulated it that way, but there was truth in his words. Insurance companies aren't technically criminals, but they destroy lives just the same. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges, a recognition of shared pain. My mother died when I was 15, poisoned by someone we trusted, someone who ate at our table, who my father considered family. The quiet admission hung in the air between us. Vulnerability offered like a gift I wasn't sure I deserved to receive. A business associate? My father's cousin. He'd been selling information to rival families for years, but we never suspected until it was too late. Antonio's voice carried no emotion, but his knuckles were white where they gripped his glass. She suffered for 3 days before she died. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong until the autopsy. I'm sorry. It taught me never to trust anyone completely. And it taught me to recognize the signs of betrayal before they become fatal. Understanding dawned. That's why you need someone who can read people. Someone who can spot the tells that most people miss. Your intervention Friday night wasn't just good instincts. You saw patterns of behavior that trained killers tried to hide. That's not a skill you learn waitressing tables. I found myself studying his face the way I'd been trained to study subjects in my criminology classes. The controlled expression that never quite concealed the pain underneath. The careful posture that spoke of constant vigilance. The way his eyes continuously swept the room even in his own home. You don't trust anyone, do you? Trust is a luxury I can't afford. That sounds like a lonely way to live. For a moment, something raw and honest flickered across his features. Loneliness is better than betrayal. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in the expensive sheets staring at the ceiling, processing the conversation with Antonio, trying to reconcile the dangerous criminal with the grieving 15-year-old who'd watched his mother die from poison administered by family. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen in search of water. The apartment was dark, except for the city lights filtering through the massive windows, creating patterns of light and shadow across the marble floors. I wasn't alone. Antonio stood at the kitchen island, fully dressed despite the late hour. Steam rose from 2 cups sitting on the granite counter, and the rich aroma of coffee filled the air. Couldn't sleep either? He asked without turning around. Too much to process. He handed me one of the cups. Perfect espresso in delicate china. It's an old family recipe. My mother used to make it when I had nightmares. The gesture was so unexpectedly intimate that it caught me off guard. This wasn't the calculated crime boss or the controlled businessman. This was just a man sharing something precious from his past. We stood in comfortable silence, drinking coffee in the soft glow of the city lights. For the first time since Friday night, I felt something other than fear or anger, something that might have been understanding. The men who killed her, I said quietly. What happened to them? My father handled it when I turned 18. All of them. And the cousin? Antonio's smile in the darkness was sharp as broken glass. That one was mine. 2 weeks of living in Antonio's gilded cage had taught me the subtle rhythms of his world. The way conversations stopped when he entered rooms. How grown men twice my size deferred to his quiet authority. The careful dance of power that played out in gestures too small for outsiders to notice, but too significant for insiders to ignore. When he finally agreed to let me return to the Golden Fork, it came with conditions that made my previous captivity seem like freedom. Vincent will drive you to and from work, Antonio explained over breakfast, his tone suggesting this wasn't negotiable. Marco will be positioned within the restaurant at all times. You don't leave the building during your shift, not even for smoke breaks. I stirred sugar into my coffee, watching the crystals dissolve while processing the implications. What about Carmen? She'll ask questions about the bodyguard. Marco knows how to blend in. Your coworkers will assume he's a customer who prefers to eat alone. The plan was more complex than I'd realized. Antonio had purchased a controlling interest in the restaurant 2 days earlier, a fact he mentioned as casually as commenting on the weather. My salary had mysteriously tripled, my schedule reduced to 3 nights a week, and suddenly there were openings for additional security personnel disguised as waitstaff. You bought the restaurant to protect me? I bought the restaurant because it made strategic sense. Your protection is a secondary benefit. Even his acts of care came wrapped in emotional distance, as if admitting he'd done something purely for my benefit would reveal a weakness he couldn't afford. Walking back into the Golden Fork felt like returning to a museum of my former life. Everything looked exactly the same. The marble floors, the soft lighting, the elegant table settings. But I moved through it like a ghost haunting familiar spaces. Carmen hugged me with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely missed me, asking about my supposed food poisoning with enough concern to make guilt twist in my stomach. "You look different," she observed as we prepped for the dinner service. "Rested, like you've been somewhere expensive. Just catching up on sleep." She studied my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd known me long enough to spot lies. "And the manicure? The subtle highlights? Food poisoning doesn't usually come with spa treatments." Heat crept up my neck. Sophia had arranged both without asking, part of what she called maintaining appropriate appearances. I'd been too emotionally drained to object. But now the evidence of luxury felt like a betrayal of who I used to be. "My sister surprised me with a girls' weekend," I lied, hating how easily deception came now. Marco arrived at 7, claiming the corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances and the kitchen corridor. He ordered methodically: appetizer, main course, dessert, eating slowly enough to justify his presence for the entire evening. Other patrons ignored him completely, which spoke to his skill at appearing invisible while remaining hypervigilant. Antonio didn't come that first night, or the second. By the third evening, I'd convinced myself he'd lost interest in his restaurant acquisition and returned to whatever criminal enterprises normally occupied his attention. I was wrong. He appeared during Thursday's dinner rush, claiming his usual table with the quiet authority that made waitstaff scramble to accommodate him. But something was different. His usual calm composure carried an edge of tension, and his eyes swept the restaurant more frequently than normal. "Good evening, Mr. Bandini," I said, approaching with the wine he always ordered. "Elena." The way he said my name sent familiar shivers down my spine. "Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Anyone asking questions about your schedule?" The question sparked immediate alarm. "What kind of questions? The kind that suggests someone's been watching you?" I thought back over the past few days, mentally cataloging interactions with customers, delivery drivers, even the homeless man who sometimes lingered near the employee entrance. There was a guy yesterday. Said he was from the city health department, asked about employee schedules and shift changes. But Carmen handled it. Antonio's expression darkened. "Describe him." Mid-30s, expensive suit, slight accent I couldn't place. He seemed more interested in the restaurant layout than actual health codes. "Mexican?" The specific question sent ice through my veins. "Maybe. Why?" Instead of answering, Antonio pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. Within minutes, Marco appeared at our table, his casual dining facade abandoned. "We need to leave," Antonio said quietly, standing with fluid grace that didn't match the urgency in his voice. "Now, I can't just abandon my shift. Carmen will understand when she realizes your life is more important than serving dinner." The parking lot behind the Golden Fork was poorly lit, shadows pooling between the few working streetlights. We'd made it halfway to Antonio's car when the first shot shattered the rear window of a sedan parked 3 spaces away. Time fractured into crystalline moments of terror and precision. Antonio's hand closed around my wrist, pulling me behind a delivery truck as more shots rang out. Marco appeared from nowhere, returning fire with the calm efficiency of someone for whom gunfights were routine occupational hazards. "Stay down," Antonio commanded, his body shielding mine as he drew his own weapon, a detail that should have terrified me but somehow didn't. In that moment, surrounded by violence and chaos, his presence felt like the only safe harbor in a storm designed to destroy me. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds, though it felt like hours. When silence finally returned, 3 bodies lay motionless in the parking lot, and Marco was speaking rapidly into his earpiece while checking the perimeter for additional threats. "Are you hurt?" Antonio's hands moved over me with professional thoroughness, checking for wounds I hadn't realized I might have sustained. "I don't think so." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "Were they trying to kill me?" "They were trying to take you. Very different objective." The distinction should have been comforting. Instead, it opened up terrifying possibilities about what capture might have involved. Vincent arrived with backup vehicles and a cleanup crew that worked with the unsettling efficiency of people who'd handled similar situations before. Within 20 minutes, the bodies were gone, the blood washed away, and the parking lot looked like nothing more dramatic had occurred than the usual dinner rush. Antonio's house was a sanctuary of controlled elegance after the chaos of the attempted kidnapping. He led me to the living room, pouring whiskey with hands that remained perfectly steady despite what we'd just survived. This was Ricardo's response to losing his men at the restaurant, he explained, settling beside me on the leather sofa. He's formed an alliance with the Sinaloa cartel. They have different methods than traditional organized crime families. More violent, more willing to involve civilians. My world has rules, boundaries that even enemies respect. Cartels operate with fewer constraints. The whiskey burned going down, but it helped steady my nerves. So what happens now? Now we eliminate the threat before it escalates further. His matter-of-fact tone suggested this was merely another business problem requiring a straightforward solution. But the way his free hand rested on my knee, thumb tracing small circles through the fabric of my dress, suggested his concern went deeper than strategic calculations. Antonio? Yes? Thank you for saving me. He set down his glass and turned to face me fully, those storm-gray eyes searching my face with an intensity that made breathing difficult. You saved me first. This is simply returning the favor. Is that all this is? Professional courtesy? Something shifted in his expression, the careful control slipping just enough to reveal the man beneath the crime boss persona. When he leaned forward, I didn't pull away. When his hand cupped my face, I leaned into the touch. And when his lips found mine, I finally understood why I'd never felt truly safe with anyone else. The kiss was nothing like the romance novels I'd read as a teenager. There was no gentle exploration, no tentative building of passion. This was hunger and desperation, and the recognition of something that had been building between us since that first night at the restaurant. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Antonio rested his forehead against mine. This complicates things, he said quietly. Everything about my life is already complicated. Not like this. Not when caring about you gives my enemies another way to hurt me. The admission hung in the air between us, vulnerable and honest, in a way I'd never expected from him. Then maybe we don't let them, I whispered. His smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. No, maybe we don't. 3 weeks had passed since that first night at the Golden Fork, and I was finally beginning to understand the careful choreography of Antonio's world, the way conversation shifted when he entered rooms, how his men communicated in glances and subtle gestures, the delicate balance of power that required constant vigilance to maintain. What I hadn't expected was how natural it would feel to be part of that world. The realization hit me Thursday evening as I watched Antonio review security reports in his study. He'd loosened his tie, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and something about the domestic intimacy of the moment made my chest tighten with unexpected longing. This dangerous, controlled man was becoming more than just my protector. He was becoming someone I cared about in ways that terrified me. You're staring, he said without looking up from the documents. I'm observing. There's a difference. That ghost of a smile I'd grown to love. And what are you observing? That you're more relaxed here than anywhere else. Your shoulders don't carry the same tension when you're behind that desk. He set down the papers and leaned back in his chair, those storm-gray eyes conducting their usual assessment. This room is the only place where I don't have to worry about threats from unexpected directions. Because you control the variables. Because I trust the security. He paused, something shifting in his expression. And because I trust you. The admission hung in the air between us, weighted with significance I was only beginning to understand. In Antonio's world, trust was currency more valuable than money, more dangerous than weapons. Antonio, I said softly, moving around the desk to stand beside his chair. He reached up, fingers tracing the line of my jaw with exquisite care. I never intended for this to happen. For what to happen? For you to matter this much. Before I could respond, his hands were in my hair, pulling me down until his mouth found mine. This kiss was different from our first. Deeper, more desperate. carrying the weight of 3 weeks of carefully maintained distance finally crumbling. When he lifted me onto the desk, scattering papers with careless abandon, I didn't protest. When his hands traced the curves of my body with reverent attention, I welcomed his touch. And when he whispered my name like a prayer against my throat, I understood that whatever happened next would change everything between us. We made love with the desperate intensity of people who'd been denied something essential for too long. Every touch was a confession. Every kiss a promise neither of us was sure we could keep. In that moment, surrounded by the trappings of his dangerous world, Antonio wasn't a crime boss. He was just a man who'd found something worth protecting beyond his own power. Afterward, as we lay entwined on the leather sofa, his fingers tracing lazy patterns across my bare shoulder, I felt safer than I had since childhood. "Stay tonight," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." But morning brought harsh realities that shattered the illusion of safety we'd built in the darkness. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Sophia appeared with the morning security briefings, a routine I'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks. But something in her expression made my blood turn cold. "There's something you need to see," she said, setting a manila folder on the marble counter with careful precision. Inside were photographs. Crime scene photos, from the look of the yellow tape and evidence markers. A young man lay sprawled across the floor of what appeared to be a small apartment, his face peaceful despite the obvious violence that had ended his life. "Who is this?" I asked, though something about the victim's features seemed familiar. "Jimmy Torino, age 24. He worked as a delivery driver for Marcelli's Italian Kitchen." Marcelli's, the restaurant where I'd worked before, the Golden Fork, where I'd spent 6 months serving pasta to families and couples on dates. Jimmy had been one of the regular delivery drivers, always polite, always smiling, always asking about my studies when he picked up orders. "Why are you showing me this?" Sophia's expression remained carefully neutral. "He was eliminated 2 days ago on Mr. Bandini's orders." The folder slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, photographs scattering across the floor. "What?" "Jimmy Torino was selling information about your previous employment, your schedule patterns, your routes home. He provided the Mexican cartel with details that would have made it easier to take you." I stared at the photos, Jimmy's face smiling up at me from what looked like a driver's license image clipped to the file. Sweet, harmless Jimmy, who'd always remembered my name and asked about my mother's health during her final months. "He was just trying to make extra money," I whispered. "Extra money that would have gotten you killed." But he didn't know that. He couldn't have understood. The information he sold was specifically about you, Miss Morrison. Your address, your work schedules, even details about your sister's college in Milwaukee. That level of detail doesn't happen by accident. The kitchen walls seemed to close in around me. Jimmy was dead because Antonio had decided his potential threat to me outweighed his right to live. A 24-year-old kid with student loans and big dreams had been executed because he'd made a stupid decision about easy money. Where is Antonio? He had meetings this morning. He should return around. I didn't wait for her to finish. I ran through the penthouse, my bare feet silent on the marble floors, searching every room until I found him in his study, speaking quietly on the phone in Italian. He looked up when I burst through the door, taking in my disheveled appearance and obvious distress. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, then set it down with deliberate care. "Elena, what's wrong?" "Jimmy Torino." Something shifted in his expression, a careful blankness that confirmed everything Sophia had told me. "You saw the report. You killed him. I eliminated a threat to your safety. He was 24 years old. He was just trying to pay off student loans." Antonio stood, moving around the desk with that predatory grace that no longer seemed protective. Now it felt dangerous in an entirely different way. He was selling information that would have led to your death or disappearance. His motivations don't change that fact. He didn't know what the information would be used for. Ignorance doesn't excuse the consequences of his choices. I backed toward the door, suddenly desperate to put distance between us. "You're talking about a person, not a business problem. Jimmy had a family, friends, a life, and now you still have yours." His voice carried no emotion, no regret. "That's what matters. To you, maybe, but not to me." Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Would you prefer I had let him continue providing intelligence to people who want to torture you for information about my operations? I would prefer you had found another solution. Maybe talked to him, paid him more than the cartel was offering, relocated him. Anything but murder. This isn't a negotiation, Elena. In my world, threats are eliminated permanently. There are no second chances, no rehabilitation programs, no appeals processes. There's survival, and there's death. The cold certainty in his voice chilled me to the bone. This was the man I'd fallen in love with. Someone capable of ordering executions with the same casual efficiency most people use to order coffee. I can't do this, I said quietly. Can't do what? Be with someone who kills people I know, people I care about, people who endanger you. Jimmy wasn't a threat. He was a victim of circumstances he didn't understand. Antonio's expression hardened. The vulnerable man from last night disappearing behind the mask of the crime boss. Then you're more naive than I thought. The words hit like a physical blow. I stared at him for a long moment, memorizing the sharp angles of his face, the cold calculation in his storm-gray eyes. This was who he really was. Everything else, the gentle touches, the whispered confessions, the careful protection, was just another form of control. I'm leaving. No, you're not. You can't keep me here against my will. I can't let you get yourself killed because you're too idealistic to understand reality. Then I guess we have a problem. I turned and walked out of his study, out of his penthouse, out of his world. Sophia made no move to stop me, though I caught her speaking urgently into her phone as I waited for the elevator. The guards in the lobby nodded politely as I passed, their expressions betraying nothing about whether they'd been ordered to let me go or stop me. By evening, I was on a Greyhound bus heading toward Detroit, watching Chicago disappear in the distance as darkness fell. My sister Jessica lived in a small apartment near Wayne State University, working on her master's degree in social work, as far from Antonio's world as I could imagine. The 4.5-hour journey gave me plenty of time to think, to process what had happened, to question every decision I'd made since that first night at the Golden Fork. I'd saved a man's life, and somehow become complicit in taking another's. I'd fallen in love with someone whose moral compass operated by rules I couldn't accept. Jessica met me at the Detroit bus station with questions in her eyes, and enough wisdom not to ask them immediately. She'd inherited our mother's intuitive understanding of when someone needed comfort more than explanations. Bad breakup? She asked as we drove through the city streets toward her apartment. Something like that. But even as I settled into her spare bedroom, trying to convince myself I'd made the right choice, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving Chicago had only made me more vulnerable, not safer. 2 days later, I would discover just how right that feeling had been. Detroit was supposed to be my sanctuary. Jessica's small apartment near Wayne State University felt worlds away from Antonio's penthouse, and the violence that had consumed my life in Chicago. For 2 days, I almost convinced myself I could disappear into academia and normal sisterly conversations about grad school stress and weekend plans. I was making coffee Tuesday morning when Jessica's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "Unknown number," she muttered, but answered anyway. "Hello?" I watched her face change from mild annoyance to confusion to stark terror in the space of heartbeats. The phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering across the kitchen floor. "Jess, what's wrong? They know about you. They said..." Her voice broke. "Elena, they said they're coming for both of us." Ice flooded my veins. "Who said that?" "I don't know." The voice was accented, maybe Spanish. "They knew your name, knew you were here, knew about Mom's medical bills, even knew about my thesis project. They said if you didn't come with them willingly, they'd take me instead." The coffee mug slipped from my hands, ceramic exploding across the linoleum floor. Antonio had been right. Leaving Chicago hadn't made me safer. It had just put Jessica in danger too. "Pack a bag," I said, my mind racing through possibilities. "Right now. We need to leave." "Elena, what's going on? Who were those people?" "I'll explain later." "Just pack whatever you can carry and..." The apartment door exploded inward, splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. 3 men in tactical gear poured through the opening, weapons drawn, moving with military precision that made my blood freeze. "Jessica Morrison," the lead man said in heavily accented English. "You come with us." "No." I stepped in front of my sister, hands raised. "Take me. I'm the one you want." He smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. "We want you to watch. To understand consequences of running from people who own you." Before I could react, one of the other men had Jessica's arm twisted behind her back, a cloth pressed over her mouth and nose. She struggled for maybe 10 seconds before going limp. 48 hours, Goldtooth said, turning his attention back to me. "You return to Chicago. You tell Bandini we have his woman's sister. He brings what we want, or she disappears forever. What do you want? Territory. Respect. Things your Mafia boyfriend stole from our organization. They were gone before I could process what had happened, leaving me alone in Jessica's destroyed apartment with the acrid smell of chemical sedatives lingering in the air. I called Antonio from Jessica's landline, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. He answered on the first ring. "Elena, they have Jessica." Silence for 3 heartbeats. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold precision that meant someone was about to die. "Where are you?" "Detroit. They said 48 hours. They want territory and respect." "I'm already in the car. Send me the address." "Antonio, Save it. We'll discuss your decision to run later. Right now we focus on getting your sister back alive." He arrived 6 hours later with an entourage that transformed Jessica's quiet neighborhood into a staging ground for military operations. Black SUVs lined the streets, men in expensive suits speaking rapidly into earpieces, surveillance equipment being deployed with practiced efficiency. Antonio found me sitting on Jessica's couch, still in the clothes I'd slept in, staring at the blood on the carpet where she'd scraped her knee during the struggle. "Tell me everything," he said, settling beside me with careful distance. I recounted the morning's events in clinical detail, my psychology training helping me remember specifics that might be important. The accents, the timing, the equipment they'd used, even the particular chemical smell that suggested military-grade sedatives. "Sinaloa," he said when I finished. "Ricardo's been busy building alliances. Can you get her back?" Something flickered in his expression. Not quite vulnerability, but close. "I've never lost someone I was protecting. I won't start with your sister." The next 12 hours unfolded like a master class in organized crime operations. Antonio's team located the cartel's temporary base through surveillance, electronic intercepts, and what Sophia euphemistically called enhanced interrogation of local contacts. Jessica was being held in an abandoned warehouse on Detroit's east side, guarded by 8 men with automatic weapons and orders to kill her if they detected any rescue attempt. "Standard cartel protocol," Antonio explained as we studied satellite images of the building. "They're expecting overwhelming force, so we give them the opposite." "What's the opposite of overwhelming force?" "Precision, psychology, using their expectations against them." That's when he turned to me with an expression I'd learned to recognize. The look he got when he was about to ask for something I wouldn't want to give. "I need your expertise," he said quietly. "Your ability to read behavioral patterns, to predict how people will react under extreme stress. You want me involved in the actual rescue. I want you to help us understand their mindset. Cartel soldiers aren't like Mafia soldiers. They operate on different psychological principles, different motivations. You studied this in school." He was right. My criminology courses had covered the differences between traditional organized crime families and drug cartels. Different recruitment methods, different loyalty structures, different responses to pressure and threat. What do you need to know? How they'll react when we take out their perimeter guards. Whether they'll kill Jessica immediately or try to use her as a bargaining chip. What kind of psychological pressure will make them make mistakes? I found myself drawn into the tactical planning, despite every rational instinct screaming that this was madness. But Jessica's life hung in the balance, and my academic knowledge might be the difference between her coming home or disappearing forever. Cartel soldiers are motivated by fear more than loyalty, I explained as Antonio's team gathered around the surveillance photos. They're afraid of their superiors, afraid of rival organizations, afraid of law enforcement. That fear makes them unpredictable, but also exploitable. How? Create multiple simultaneous threats, Make them think they're being attacked from different directions by different groups. Their training will fracture. Some will follow protocol, others will panic, others will try to negotiate. That division gives you opportunities. Antonio nodded slowly. And Jessica? I studied the warehouse layout, thinking through cartel psychology and operational procedures. They won't kill her immediately. She's too valuable as leverage. But if they think the rescue attempt is failing, if they believe they're all going to die anyway, they'll execute her to deny you the victory. So we make sure they never reach that conclusion. Or we make them believe cooperation is their only chance of survival. Something shifted in Antonio's expression as he processed my words. This wasn't just academic analysis anymore. I was actively participating in planning a military operation against the people who'd taken my sister. Elena, he said quietly, there's something else you need to understand about Jimmy Torino. My stomach clenched. What about him? He wasn't just selling general information about your schedule. He was providing detailed intelligence about your sister. Her address, her class schedule, her daily routines. The cartel has been planning this for weeks. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Jimmy hadn't just put me at risk. He'd made Jessica a target. His harmless side income had painted a bullseye on the most important person in my world. If I hadn't eliminated him, Antonio continued, they would have taken her weeks ago. Possibly killed her after extracting what information they could about you. I stared at the warehouse photos spread across the table, seeing them with new understanding. Jimmy's death hadn't just been about protecting me. It had been about protecting Jessica, too. I understand now, I said quietly. In your world, hesitation means death, for everyone we care about. Something fundamental shifted in my chest. Not quite forgiveness, but acceptance. The moral landscape of Antonio's world operated by rules I'd never wanted to learn. But ignoring those rules had nearly cost Jessica her life. What do you need me to do? His smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. Help me get your sister back. Then help me end Ricardo Torino permanently. Over the next 6 hours, I found myself fully integrated into Antonio's team in ways I'd never imagined possible. My psychology background proved invaluable for predicting cartel behavior patterns, and my intimate knowledge of Jessica helped plan approach routes that wouldn't trigger her panic responses during the rescue. By dawn, we had a plan that was audacious in its complexity and terrifying in its implications. The rescue would happen during shift change at the warehouse, when guards were most likely to be distracted. But more than that, we were going to use the rescue operation as bait to draw Ricardo and his cartel allies into the open for a final confrontation. One way or another, Antonio said as his team made final preparations. This ends tomorrow night. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the dangerous crime boss or the careful protector, but the man who'd dropped everything to help save my sister, the man whose world I was choosing to enter. Not as a prisoner this time, but as a partner. Together, I said. His hand found mine, fingers intertwining with surprising gentleness. Together, the golden fork at midnight felt like returning to a crime scene. Empty tables sat shrouded in shadows, their white tablecloths ghostly in the dim security lighting. I stood at the staff entrance, wearing the same black uniform I'd worn months ago when this nightmare began, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Remember, Antonio's voice crackled through the earpiece hidden beneath my hair. You're just Elena Morrison, back for a late shift to help with inventory. Natural movements, familiar patterns. I pushed through the service door, muscle memory guiding me past the prep stations and into the dining room. Ricardo had chosen this location for psychological warfare, forcing Antonio to relive the place where their conflict began. But he'd made a critical error in choosing ground I knew better than any of his soldiers. The restaurant wasn't empty. 3 men sat at strategic positions around the dining room, trying to look casual while maintaining sightlines to all entrances. I recognized the behavioral patterns immediately. The forced relaxation that screamed hypervigilance, the way their eyes tracked my movement without seeming to watch. I count 3 visible, I whispered, adjusting the flower arrangement at table 6 with practiced ease. 2 more shadows near the kitchen entrance. Classic cartel formation. They're expecting a frontal assault. Through the earpiece, I heard Antonio coordinating with his team positioned around the building's perimeter. Vincent had eyes on the rear exit. Marco covered the main entrance. 2 other men I'd never met were stationed at emergency exits Ricardo's people wouldn't know existed. "Target acquired," came Vincent's voice. "Jessica Morrison, northwest corner booth. Zip tie restraints. Conscious but sedated." My heart clenched, seeing my sister through the kitchen service window, slumped in the booth where Antonio had once sat as my regular customer. Her eyes were glazed but alert, tracking movement around her with the same analytical observation skills we'd inherited from Mom. "She sees me," I murmured, catching Jessica's slight nod of recognition. "She's aware enough to follow instructions. Rodriguez, you're clear to move on the perimeter guards." Antonio's voice carried deadly calm through the comm system. "Elena, we need eyes on Ricardo." I moved through my old workspace with deliberate familiarity, checking wine inventory while scanning for the man who'd turned my life into a war zone. The psychological analysis I'd provided proved accurate. Cartel soldiers operated differently than Mafia soldiers, their paranoia making them jumpy, reactive rather than strategic. That's when I saw him. One of Antonio's men, positioned near the bar with a clear view of the dining room, displayed all the micro-expressions I'd studied in my behavioral analysis courses. Rapid eye movements, involuntary swallowing, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested extreme stress. But not the stress of impending combat, the stress of deception. "Antonio," I whispered, "the man at the bar. Dark suit, positioning himself behind you. He's showing deception markers. Impossible. That's Salvatore. He's been with my family for 8 years. Trust me. Watch his hands, involuntary finger tapping, classic self-soothing behavior under extreme stress. His breathing is shallow, elevated heart rate visible in his neck pulse. He's terrified, but not of Ricardo's men. He's terrified of what he's about to do." Through the service window, I watched Salvatore's hand move slowly toward his jacket. Not the smooth, practiced motion of someone drawing a weapon in combat, but the hesitant, guilt-ridden movement of someone betraying everything they'd sworn to protect. "Gun!" I hissed into the comm. "Left side jacket. He's positioning for a back shot." The next 30 seconds unfolded with brutal precision. Antonio spun just as Salvatore's weapon cleared his holster, muscle memory and years of survival instincts saving his life. The shot went wide, shattering a mirror behind the bar. Before Salvatore could fire again, Antonio's return shot caught him center mass, dropping him behind the mahogany bar. The gunshot triggered chaos. Ricardo's men abandoned their pretense of casual dining, weapons appearing from beneath jackets and under tables. But Antonio's team was already in motion, months of tactical preparation paying off as they moved with coordinated precision through entry points Ricardo's soldiers hadn't anticipated. I used the chaos to my advantage, moving through spaces only staff would know. The service corridor behind the kitchen, the storage room with its emergency exit, the wine cellar's secondary access tunnel that led directly to the booth where Jessica waited. "Elena, report." Antonio's voice was strained, background sounds suggesting heavy fighting in the main dining room. "Reaching Jessica now. Give me 30 seconds. My sister looked up as I emerged from behind the service station, relief flooding her features despite the chemical fog clouding her eyes. "Elena, I'm getting you out of here." The zip tie restraints required kitchen shears from the prep station. Precious seconds while gunfire echoed through the restaurant above us. Jessica's hands were numb from restricted circulation, but she could walk if I supported her weight. "Service tunnel," I explained, guiding her toward the maintenance corridor that connected to the building next door. Same route we used for wine deliveries during busy nights. The tunnel was cramped and dark, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that had been installed when the building was renovated decades earlier. Jessica stumbled twice, the sedatives affecting her coordination, but adrenaline kept her moving toward the exit that would put us 3 blocks away from the combat zone. We emerged in the alley behind Marconi's Deli, where Vincent waited with an idling SUV. Jessica collapsed into the back seat, exhaustion and chemical after-effects finally overwhelming her system. "Secure," I reported through the comm. "Jessica's safe." "Good, because Ricardo just entered through the kitchen." I looked back toward the Golden Fork, seeing muzzle flashes through the windows, knowing Antonio was fighting for his life in the place where we'd first met. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get Jessica to a hospital, to put as much distance as possible between us and the violence. Instead, I found myself running back toward the restaurant. "Elena, what are you doing?" Vincent's voice chased me down the alley. "My job." I knew the Golden Forks layout better than anyone fighting inside it. I knew the blind spots, the service routes, the structural weaknesses that decades of operation had revealed. And I knew that Ricardo would retreat to the kitchen when pressed. It offered multiple escape routes and defensible positions. The kitchen access was through the loading dock, a route that bypassed the main fighting. I could hear Antonio and Ricardo's voices echoing off the stainless steel surfaces, their confrontation having devolved into the personal, primal combat that would end only with death. "You made this personal when you took her sister." Antonio's voice carried cold fury. "I made it profitable. Your attachment to the girl shows weakness. Weakness your enemies will exploit." I peered around the corner of the prep station, seeing the two men circling each other with predatory intensity. Both had abandoned firearms for the close-quarters brutality that would determine territorial dominance. Ricardo held a kitchen knife with professional familiarity. Antonio had claimed a meat cleaver, its weight lending devastating power to each swing. The fight was vicious and brief. Ricardo was younger, faster, but Antonio fought with the calculated precision of someone for whom violence was a tool rather than a passion. When Ricardo overextended during a thrust, Antonio caught his wrist, twisted until bone snapped, and brought the cleaver down with surgical accuracy. Ricardo Torino died as he'd lived, violently, without honor, far from the territory he'd tried to claim. Antonio stood over the body for a long moment, breathing heavily, cleaver still gripped in his white-knuckled fist. When he looked up and saw me watching from the doorway, something shifted in his expression. From the cold satisfaction of victory to concern for my well-being. "You should be with your sister. She's safe. Vincent has her." "Then why are you here?" I stepped over the debris of overturned equipment and scattered utensils, stopping close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to see the minor cuts decorating his knuckles and forearms. "Because this is where we started. In this kitchen, with me serving you dinner and you protecting me from threats I couldn't see. It seemed right that this is where it ends." He set down the cleaver with deliberate care, his hands finding my face with surprising gentleness, given what they'd just accomplished. "It's not ending, Elena. It's just beginning." The sirens were getting closer. Chicago PD responding to reports of automatic gunfire in the city's restaurant district. But Antonio's cleanup crew was already in motion. Evidence disappearing with the same professional efficiency I'd witnessed in Detroit. "We need to leave," he said, taking my hand. "Together?" His smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous, but his eyes held warmth I'd never expected to see from a man like him. Always together. 2 years had transformed everything, yet nothing had changed at all. I stood in the conference room of Bandini Hospitality Consulting, watching 6 men in expensive suits struggle to maintain eye contact with me as I reviewed their psychological evaluations. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gone from serving wine to mob bosses to psychologically profiling potential mob soldiers, all while maintaining the fiction that I ran a legitimate business consultancy. "Mr. Castellano," I said, addressing the youngest candidate, "your micro-expressions during the loyalty questions suggest deception, specifically involuntary lip compression and decreased eye contact when discussing hypothetical conflicts of interest." The 28-year-old shifted uncomfortably, his hands betraying the nervous energy I'd learned to recognize in people hiding dangerous secrets. Behind the one-way glass, I knew Antonio was watching, evaluating my assessment alongside his own instincts about which men could be trusted with his family's operations. "Tell me about your gambling debts," I continued, noting how his pupils dilated at the direct question. 3 of the 6 candidates would be eliminated based on psychological risk factors I'd identified. The other 3 would join the Bandini organization in various capacities: legitimate restaurant management, security consultation, and what Sophia delicately termed specialized problem resolution. My phone buzzed with a text from Antonio. "Impressive as always. Dinner at home tonight? The doctor's appointment is at 3. I touched my still flat abdomen reflexively, 4 months of pregnancy barely showing despite the morning sickness that had been plaguing me for weeks. Dr. Martinez assured us everything was progressing normally, but Antonio's protective instincts had shifted into overdrive since we'd confirmed the pregnancy. The Bandini restaurant empire had grown from the single location where we'd met to 12 establishments throughout Chicago and Milwaukee. Each served dual purposes: legitimate businesses that employed local communities and provided excellent food, while also functioning as secure meeting locations and communication hubs for Antonio's less legal enterprises. I'd become indispensable to the operation, not as Antonio's wife or the future mother of his child, but as a professional whose expertise in behavioral analysis had prevented 3 attempted infiltrations by law enforcement and identified 2 potential traitors before they could cause significant damage. "Mrs. Bandini," Castellano said, using the formal address that still sent shivers down my spine. "I can explain about the gambling." "No need," I interrupted, making notes in his file. "Acknowledging the debt shows integrity. Lying about it would have been disqualifying. Your psychological profile suggests you're motivated by family loyalty rather than personal gain, which makes you suitable for customer relations management rather than security work." The distinction mattered in Antonio's world. Customer relations meant interfacing with legitimate businesses and maintaining the respectable facade that kept authorities from looking too closely at Bandini operations. Security work meant being trusted with family secrets that could destroy everything if revealed. After the evaluations concluded, I retreated to my office, a space that straddled the line between legitimate psychology practice and organized crime consulting. My degrees hung on the walls alongside certificates in crisis negotiation and behavioral analysis, professional credentials that provided perfect cover for the real work I performed. Sophia appeared with my afternoon coffee, a routine we'd maintained since my return from Detroit 2 years earlier. "The Torino territory has been fully integrated," she reported, setting down the cup with her usual efficiency. "Revenue projections for the restaurant division are exceeding expectations by 30%. I nodded, reviewing the quarterly reports that told 2 stories. One for tax authorities showing healthy profits from legitimate food service operations. Another for Antonio detailing the actual revenue streams that funded our lifestyle and operations. Any behavioral concerns with the new hires? 2 servers at the Lincoln Park location show signs of potential substance abuse issues. Marco recommended monitoring rather than immediate termination. Smart. Firing people created resentment and potential security risks. Monitoring them allowed us to provide help if needed, or gather intelligence if they became compromised by law enforcement seeking informants. The doctor's appointment confirmed what we already knew. Our daughter was developing normally, with a due date in early September. Antonio's hand never left mine during the ultrasound, his usual composed demeanor cracking slightly when the technician pointed out tiny fingers and toes on the grainy image. "Have you considered names?" Dr. Martinez asked as we scheduled the next appointment. "Isabella," Antonio said immediately. "After my mother." I squeezed his hand, understanding the significance. Naming our daughter after the woman whose death had shaped Antonio's worldview was both tribute and promise. That this child would grow up protected in ways his mother never was. That evening, we sat in our private study reviewing security reports from the training facility Antonio had built in an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side. What appeared to be a corporate team-building center actually served as a finishing school for organized crime professionals, teaching everything from defensive driving to digital counter-surveillance to the kind of behavioral analysis I'd pioneered. "The Martinez brothers graduated yesterday," Antonio reported, showing me files on 2 young men who'd completed the 8-week program. They'll be managing the new Milwaukee expansion. I reviewed their psychological profiles, noting the markers that suggested loyalty, intelligence, and the particular kind of moral flexibility required for success in Antonio's organization. They'd be successful. I'd recommended them personally after conducting extensive behavioral evaluations. "And the Santini situation?" Antonio's expression hardened. "Resolved permanently. Vincent confirmed the elimination this morning." I didn't flinch anymore at casual mentions of murder. 2 years of living in Antonio's world had taught me that violence was simply another business tool, applied with the same calculated precision as any other operational decision. The psychological adjustment had taken months, but I'd learned to compartmentalize the moral implications in service of protecting the family we were building. Our wedding had been small, private, held in the chapel of a cathedral. Antonio's family had supported for 3 generations. Jessica had served as my maid of honor, her own psychological recovery from the kidnapping, complete enough that she'd finished her master's degree and accepted a position at a Detroit social services agency. She understood, if she didn't entirely approve of, the choices I'd made. "I have something for you," Antonio said, producing a small velvet box from his desk drawer. Inside was a pair of earrings, sapphires surrounded by diamonds, elegant enough for any social occasion, but fitted with nearly invisible tracking devices that would allow his security team to locate me within 3 feet, anywhere in the city. "They're beautiful," I said, meaning it despite understanding their dual purpose. "And functional. The battery life is 6 months, and they're waterproof to 30 meters. I put them on immediately, appreciating how they complemented the engagement ring that had replaced my simple wedding band 6 months earlier. Everything in our life served multiple purposes: beauty and function, legitimate business and criminal enterprise, love and strategic alliance. The mansion we called home sat on 20 acres north of the city, surrounded by walls, cameras, and enough security personnel to repel a small army. But inside those walls, we'd created something that felt remarkably like a normal life. Antonio cooked elaborate Italian dinners on weekends. I maintained a small garden where I grew herbs for the restaurants. We read together in the evenings, discussing everything from business strategy to baby names to the psychological profiles of people who'd requested audiences with the head of the Bandini family. My consulting practice had grown beyond Antonio's organization, attracting clients from law enforcement agencies, corporate security firms, and even other crime families seeking psychological evaluation services. The reputation I'd built as Dr. Elena Morrison Bandini, specialist in behavioral analysis and threat assessment, provided perfect cover for my real work while generating substantial legitimate income. 6 months remained until our daughter's arrival. 6 months to finalize the succession planning that would eventually see Antonio transition from hands-on operational control to strategic oversight. The empire we were building would someday be hers, legitimate businesses backed by the kind of power and protection that only a true crime family could provide. I stood at the window of our bedroom, watching the sun set over the lake that bordered our property, feeling Isabella move restlessly in response to my shifting position. In the distance, lights were coming on in the training facility, where tomorrow's class of carefully selected candidates would learn the skills necessary for success in our world. Antonio appeared behind me, his arms circling my waist with practiced care, his hands settling protectively over our growing child. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I leaned back against his solid presence, thinking about the woman I'd been 2 years earlier. Frightened, naive, convinced that moral absolutes could govern complex realities. That Elena Morrison would have been horrified by the choices I'd made, the world I'd embraced, the man I'd married. "None," I said, and meant it completely. Our reflection in the window showed what we'd become. A crime boss and his psychologist wife, partners in every sense of the word, building an empire that would last generations. Isabella kicked as if in approval, already part of the family business that would someday be her inheritance. Outside our fortress, Chicago hummed with activity, unaware that significant portions of its restaurant industry, its security consulting services, and its behavioral health networks were controlled by the couple standing at this window, planning a future that balanced legitimate success with the kind of power that could only be built on carefully controlled violence. From now on, we were exactly where we belonged,